Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Magpie Speaks by R. Alan Chappell, narrated by Kaipo Schwab. 1. Magpie Speaks. In that far-off time of hunger and depredation, it seemed only right that he, being an old man and no longer as useful as he once had been, should draw away from the others and plan his entrance to the netherworld. The very young were already gone, and the few older children left to the clans grew weak, and even they were being silently judged. Only the very strongest would meet the challenges ahead. Before the old man should leave his people for good, however, there was a thing he must do, something he wouldn't have had the courage for in better days, one last thing to attend before committing himself to that nothingness that lies beyond. He trembled at the thought of it. These hard and desperate times clutched at him like fingers from the grave. The harsh cry of a magpie shattered the stillness like a gunshot. Paul Tsotsi woke with a start and for just a moment was unable to disengage himself from the dream. The same dream that had troubled him for weeks, in the beginning only occasionally, but now nearly every time he nodded off, which was often, as he was old himself, and took his ease where he found it. Magpie sat atop a scrub oak, and in the haughty manner of its kind cocked a sparkling eye at the old singer, and gurgled deep in its throat. He well knew that magpies can speak should they take a notion, and often see well beyond the world of man. With a flip of its tail, the bird flew down to the sheep and landed on the back of a ram, causing Paul to lean away from the shaggy bark cedar and peer down at the trickster. He could not shake the notion the bird was trying to tell him something, and wondered what it might be to make the creature so bold. Ah-ah-ee picked at the ram's lanolin-rich wool and preened its feathers with an oily beak. The old man allowed his eye to follow the bird for a long minute, hoping for some glimmer of understanding, but eventually lost interest and turned his attention to the sheep. He missed nothing. Each ewe and lamb was accounted for as natural as breathing, the herdsman's instinct. Not everyone had it. As the old man watched and pondered the way of these things, he let his hand fall to the dog beside him, old like himself, but still of good use when it came to the sheep. "That's about all the two of us are good for now," he thought. "Just the sheep." The dog roused himself, came to attention, twitched, and readied himself to launch with no spoken word to guide him, the lift of a finger or push of the chin enough to send him bounding away to correct some laggard or tighten the flock. The dog, like the man, made allowance for disparities of age. The dream had begun to wear on the old Dine, pecking away at the edge of his mind even when awake. Paul knew he was the old man in the dream, and was certain now it was a message. He was, after all, Hatali, a singer, and had come to expect these premonitions from time to time. Still, he couldn't make heads or tails of this one. The sun was on the downhill slide, and finally he motioned for the dog to start the gather that would take them close to sunset. His daughter and her husband probably wouldn't be back from their shopping, and it would be left for him to watch for the school bus. It wasn't that Thomas Begay's children couldn't manage for themselves, but those two young ones expected him to be there, and he took a certain satisfaction in that. Secretly, of course, it was the children who were charged with watching out for the old man, making sure he didn't forget to take something for his lunch, and found his way home with the sheep at the end of day. They now considered him their achai, or grandfather, and had acquired that particularly close attachment for the elderly so often seen in Navajo children. The old still are given their due among the Dine. The breeze carried the sharp edge of change, a sure harbinger of autumn in that country, and to Paul's way of thinking, the finest time of year in Dineta. The thought of it caused him to sigh. Did the dream mean this would be his last? As he closed the gate, the old man, weary now, looked across the corrals and was pleased to see the girl and her brother already trudging up the rutted track. A little distance behind them, first one, then another pickup turned off the highway and trailed along behind. When Thomas Begay pulled his truck alongside his children, he stopped and motioned for them to jump in back with the boxes of groceries. They wedged themselves between two water barrels, filled at the free pump in Shiprock, laughed as they dangled their legs off the back of the truck, and listened to the water slapping around inside the steel barrels. They knew that water would have to last at least a week. Over the years, the government had thrown up earthen dams to form water tanks for range stock, but household water still had to be hauled. It was just a part of life in the Dinibikeya. Wells could be drilled, but that was expensive, and the water, if found, was often not good. The children waved at their grandfather as Thomas's blue Dodge pulled into the yard ahead of Charlie Yazzie's official tribal unit. Old Paul Tsotsi smiled when he spied 2-year-old Joseph Wiley propped up between Charlie and Sue. Paul thought the boy an extraordinary child, certain he would someday make the people proud. All the signs and omens pointed to it, but only if Paul could ward off the evil that threatened the boy. The old singer had made many prayers on the night of his birth, and felt certain it was that intervention that kept the child safe even now. The cord had wrapped around the infant's neck while yet in the womb. The young doctor himself called it a miracle the boy survived, and Paul became even more convinced it was his prayers that had made the difference. It was a particularly strong curse laid by the Witch of Ganado those many years before, and only time would tell if Paul Tsotsi's efforts might effect a permanent cure. Maybe that is what the dream is about, Paul thought. Does it all go back to Harley Ponyboy? He was the one who had angered the witch. Edward Bitsinee had looked Harley right in the eye that spring day, when he declared, "Any time you come near a pregnant woman, she will lose her baby." He had then spat on the ground and washed his hands in the air. It was widely known that Harley's young wife, Anita, still blamed this curse for losing 2 babies in a row. She was told by doctors not to try again. The water barrels were slid down cedar posts from the flatbed truck and walked over to their place beside the Hogan door. Everyone helped carry in the groceries, and Lucy Tallwoman began telling her father how they had met up with the Yazzies in town. When Sue Yazzie heard of the progress on Lucy's new blanket, still on the loom, she couldn't wait to see how it turned out. This would be Lucy Tallwoman's 3rd Yei piece in as many years. They were becoming her trademark, and had made her well known among collectors. Other weavers thought her prices too high, and she became the talk of that part of the Dinibikeya on account of it. In the brush arbor next to the Hogan, everyone, even the children, gathered round the loom, while Lucy Tallwoman explained the meaning of the stunning piece. 6 crimson yei, or spirit helpers, separated by stylized corn plants, set against a soft gray background. These were holy symbols for the Dine, and even the children grew silent at the sight of them. The blanket had been many months in the weaving. Commissioned by a wealthy New York collector, it was scheduled for delivery within the next few days. Lucy pointed out the Chei Honiti, the nearly invisible spirit path woven into the lower edge of the blanket. Each family of weavers passed down a traditional but often different method of weaving in that intentional flaw. It was sometimes no more than a thin cotton thread, barely visible to the casual observer. Lucy's mother, however, had taught her to continue the line out to a loose yarn tail, which exited the blanket in the lower right corner. It was a very old way of releasing the weaver's spirit from a work, allowing her to move on to the next piece and not leave a part of herself trapped in the finished blanket. In this way, Lucy felt connected to her mother and those other weavers who had gone before. She thought to herself in Navajo, "Akotigo dine, asdajan, nishli." In this way, I am a Navajo woman. Over the years, this little wool tail had become her signature and was widely recognized among knowledgeable collectors. Traditional weaving had come a long way from the time when traders bought blankets by weight, and Navajo women were reduced to pounding sand into the finished work to make it weigh more and bring more money. Traders soon caught on and would give each blanket a good shake, but the natural lanolin held the bulk of the sand just the same. It had all begun around 1871 with the hated Indian agent William Arney, a prejudiced man with a missionary mindset, and determined that Indians should see the light. The Navajo called him the Tarantula, and his single saving grace was initiating a campaign to create a market for Navajo blankets back east. He thought the blankets to be the only viable product the people produced, one that might help defray government expenditures in their support. Arney, of course, was deeply involved in the marketing process and profited accordingly. Those were the dark times after the people's long walk from their incarceration down on the Bosque Redondo, and to this day the stories of that travesty are passed down through the clans and remembered. "I would like to get this blanket out of the summer hogan before bad weather sets in," Lucy confided, as she and Sue Yazzie put their heads together to examine the piece. She looked around to make sure the children weren't listening, and whispered, "Our old hogan is getting a little cramped now that the kids are here. It's a good thing they're in school during the day, or I would never get anything done." She said this last part with a smile, and then, "But still I don't know what I would do without them. They are like my own now, and are becoming a big help with the sheep." Sue nodded and smiled, knowing how much time little Joseph Wiley took from her own day. She turned her attention back to the loom. "Well, it's truly a beautiful piece of work. I wish I could afford one like it some day, but I doubt that's going to happen any time soon," she smiled ruefully. "I have a smaller one my aunt wove for me when I was little, but it's nothing like this." Lucy nodded. "With what this blanket will bring, Thomas thinks we will have nearly enough put away to build a separate house, just for us. My father won't leave the old hogan. He says it's a spiritual place, and he needs that." She reflected for a moment. "I'd like a real house like yours. The electric people say the new lines will pass along the road soon. Then it won't take much for us to have electricity right here, and we're told phone service won't be far behind the electricity. Wouldn't that be something?" Sue was happy for her friend and was well aware what it meant to her. "You've come so far with your weaving." She laughed as she said, "The trader told Charlie he considers you the best weaver on the reservation." Lucy Tallwoman had not heard that, but in her heart knew it was true, and smiled at the thought of it. She didn't think it arrogant to feel this way. Her mother had been a very good weaver and often told her, "There is something extra in certain people that takes them beyond what others can do." Lucy had already proven this true. Sue knew most traditional Navajo have an inherent appreciation of art in any form, but fine traditional blankets, or rugs, as some Biligana still insist on calling them, are especially near to their hearts. They take great pride in any they are able to afford or those that pass down through the family. They are never used as a floor covering in a Navajo home. Lucy wove the lighter, more traditional blanket, not only a thing of beauty, but one that would keep a person from the cold should they choose to use it in that way. The women remained in the brush shelter, going over samples of wool collected from Lucy's own churro sheep and the crocks of natural dyes she preferred. These materials were hard to come by now, but in her view were essential and one of the secrets of her success. Their soft earth tones mimicked the land itself and were integral to the culture. Some weavers bought their wool already spun and substituted modern aniline dyes, then pretended not to understand why collectors didn't prefer this more garish work. Thomas Begay and the other two men moved outside the shelter and stood watching the children. The older two had taken charge of Joseph Wiley and were trundling the toddler off to the sheep pens to see their lambs, gifts from their stepmother. Navajo children acquire livestock at quite an early age and become responsible for their care, the thought being that having their own stock might increase interest in the herding and general care of the family flock. After accumulating a few animals, these young stockmen might be expected to contribute the occasional one to the family larder, or for some ceremony aimed at the good of the people. While sometimes hard for them, they learn the importance of giving and generosity, and how those family clan members who have must endeavor to help those who don't. It was hoped they would see how everyone's hojo benefits from this and allows them to take away a part of that blessing for themselves. Charlie Yazzie knew that in olden times, Navajo children enjoyed nearly the same personal rights as an adult and were never forced to give up any of their property without their consent. They retained right of ownership over their personal possessions just as an adult would. Charlie smiled as he watched Caleb and Ida Marie help his son through the corral poles and work their way through the ewes to the lambs. This is the way it was meant to be, he thought. Older children, watching out for younger ones. Everyone responsible for everyone else, learning from each other. This is the Navajo way, and how it has always been, how it should always be. Charlie didn't consider himself a traditionalist in regard to some of the older customs or beliefs, but still maintained strong ties to the culture in other ways. He thought of himself as a forward-thinking Navajo, one who wanted his people to take their place in a more modern Navajo nation. Joseph Wiley wasn't afraid of the sheep, even when the larger of the two rams came right up to him, wrinkled its nose, and bared its teeth, the better to catch his scent. The boy laughed and reached out to touch the ram, who shook his head, pawing the ground a time or two before backing off. Even Paul Tsotsi smiled at this and was reaffirmed in his belief that this baby was somehow special and worth the effort it took to shield him from evil. Charlie Yazzie turned from the children and surprised the other two men by announcing, "I had a letter from Professor Custer yesterday. You might remember he last wrote that things were not going so well at the university." Paul Tsotsi came immediately to attention. "I don't remember hearing about that. What has happened with the professor?" Paul still hadn't forgotten being passed over for a position on Custer's last project, which, as it turned out, was a good thing. Harley Ponyboy had instead been given the job, and while he maintained it was not his fault, things had not gone well. Paul didn't really blame either man. He liked Harley and had, at the time, considered the professor's poor judgment a fault of his drinking. Harley, being caught up in that, had been his own failing in his opinion. Charlie went on. "Apparently there was some fallout from Dr. Custer's last project." He paused and shook his head. "But still, the professor didn't suspect his job might be in danger. It seems a few faculty members in his department filed complaints and passed along rumors of his drinking in the field. Everyone knew this was coming, of course, and most were only surprised it hadn't happened sooner." Charlie frowned. "Everyone knew it, except George Custer himself. In any case, he was offered the choice of retiring and, by virtue of his tenure, be eligible for a nice little pension. Or he could battle the Board of Regents, something that might not have ended so well." Charlie looked at the other two before going on. "In the letter he says he's tired of resting on what few laurels he might have left, and is now considering starting his own business, salvage archaeology. Claims it's a big thing right now, what with the renewed interest in the gas fields and increasing government mandates against violating prehistoric sites." Charlie paused. "Not only is there some money to be made, but some real and lasting good could come of it, too." Thomas Begay cocked an eye. "And what might salvage archaeology be exactly?" "Well, I'm not certain myself at this point, but I'm sure George will be more than happy to fill us in when he gets out here next week. He did say I should mention there might be a job for you and Harley Ponyboy should you care to join the operation." Old man Paul Tsotsi scowled. "He didn't say nothing about me?" Charlie cleared his throat and looked away. "Not in so many words, Paul, but I'm sure someone with your previous experience would be high on his list." Charlie was aware Paul had worked as a laborer under several prominent archaeologists over the years, and that he actually had quite a good grasp of basic field procedures. The old man snorted and turned toward the brush arbor before throwing back over his shoulder, "Well, if he does mention me when he gets here, you tell him I'm too busy." Thomas Begay watched as his father-in-law walked away and waited till he was out of sight before shaking his head. "He's in no shape to work an excavation, and I'm sure the professor knows it too. But the old man won't let it go. It's been a sore spot since that last dig. Maybe you could ask the professor if there isn't something Paul could do. He writes a fine hand and seems to know something about field work too." Charlie sighed and looked away again, saying, "I'll see what I can do, but Paul's really not looking well. I'm not sure he's up to it." "Maybe not, but it would be nice if he could at least have the satisfaction of turning down an offer." Maybe. I'll talk to George and see what he thinks." Charlie didn't like leading the old man on if nothing was to come of it. Lucy Tallwoman asked the Yazzie family to supper, but Sue declined, saying Charlie had warned her they could only stay a few minutes. "He said he wants to stop by Harley Ponyboy's place on the way back into town, tell him about Professor Custer and the chance of a job. Harley hasn't had it easy of late, and everyone knows he thinks a lot of the professor. Harley says George is about the only white he's known that treats him right." Paul Tsotsi went directly to his cot in the summer hogan and lay down to await the call to supper. He tried not to fall asleep, as that would bring the dream. Perhaps he would go to the sweat lodge in the morning. Maybe that would help. He and Thomas had built a small earth and stone sweat lodge back behind the hogan, and several people had already come to him for the service. He was still thinking of the cleansing when he drifted quietly off to sleep. Later, Haggard and irritable, the old singer had come in, took his place at the table, and hunkered over a cup of coffee. He thought only of the dream. There was more to the story of the Witch of Ganado than the rest of them knew. He had known for years it might someday come to this. There weren't many left who would test the will of a witch, maybe even a Yinaldeloshi. No, it was a job better left to him, one who had trained under the same master. Their old uncle, Elmore Shining Horse, had taught them both well, but in different directions. As he helped his children with their homework, Thomas Begay occasionally glanced over at his father-in-law. Thomas had an unusually sharp mind, and despite his own lackluster performance at boarding school, insisted his children should do their best at the New Day facility. This was a newer, more modern way of thinking for Thomas. In his father's day, a child had only to say he didn't want to do a certain thing, and, within certain limits, that was the way it would be. Thomas, however, had come to see the good in education, and considered the nearby school a great improvement over children being whisked away to boarding school, where they might not see their families for months on end. He knew how that was, and tried to help all he could to make this new educational approach work for his own kids. His college-educated friend, Charlie Yazzie, had been a great influence in this regard. Thomas glanced over at his wife as she busied herself at the cook stove. She hummed to herself as she stirred a pot and readied their supper. He thought he had been fortunate to find such a fine woman, and one so good to his children. They both looked up to Lucy and took pains to please her. Thomas couldn't help but be proud and felt himself lucky beyond his due. Lucy's mind was elsewhere, and it really didn't register when her father mumbled, "I expect I'll have to kill him." "Kill what, she say?" Lucy asked, still not paying full attention. Perhaps it was that goat with one horn he was talking about. The animal had a mean streak, had twice tried to hook one of the children, and would have if not for the dog. "Why, that witch that's causing all this trouble." The old man gazed into his coffee cup, didn't like the look of it, and added more canned milk. "He's been needing a good killing for a long time." Thomas Begay took notice at this and wrinkled his brow. "What witch trouble is that, Paul?" Thomas was still quite traditional when it came to witches, and grew cautious at the very mention of them. The old man didn't answer, but stirred his coffee furiously and stared at the far wall. Thomas was beginning to wonder if his father-in-law might be losing his mind. 2. The Drunk. It was nearly dark when Charlie Yazzie pulled up to Ponyboy's ramshackle trailer and found the place deserted. Not a single animal in the corral, and Anita's truck nowhere to be seen. The beginnings of a night wind stirred the dust of the corrals and caused a loose screen door to bang. Now where do you suppose they've gone off to, Charlie wondered. They don't get out much. At least Harley don't. He hasn't had a license to drive for years. He doesn't even have his mule Shorty anymore. Sue looked through a veil of wind-blown dust at the deserted yard and pointed to the screen door, hanging askew and swinging noisily on its hinges. "It doesn't look to me like they've been here for a while. When's the last time you saw Harley, anyway?" Charlie rubbed his jaw. "I guess it's been a week, maybe more. He dropped by the office, but when he saw I was busy with a caseworker, told the receptionist he would catch me later and then just never came back. I've been so busy I hadn't really thought about it till just now." He paused and raised an eyebrow at his wife. "That's just not like Harley at all." On their way back into town, Charlie looked over at Sue and said, "Tomorrow's Sunday. Thomas and Harley both are supposed to come in and help me fix the horse shed." He shook his head. "It's only been a month since I finished the damn thing, and it's already falling down." And then, almost as an afterthought, "Thomas said it wouldn't last." In the dim glow of the instrument panel, Sue cuddled the baby on her lap and smiled to herself. There was a storm that night. A low-pressure system formed over that rugged country beyond Ute Mountain and sat itself astraddle the Colorado border. By midnight, the wind people raged down the La Plata Valley, howled up and down the frigid waters of the San Juan, and for miles in either direction, the river whipped itself to a brown froth. The next morning Charlie stood at the corral and scowled at his shed. It now leaned even more, and threatened to come down completely should there be more weather. He cursed out loud, causing the two horses to perk up their ears and back even farther from the structure. They had been suspicious of it from the start, and now looked from the shed to the builder, and Charlie thought he could see blame in their eyes. He cursed again and glowered at the pair. When he thought about it, he had never actually seen either of these horses in the shelter since he built it. His grandfather had probably been right. "Horses don't need no barn in this country," he'd said. "They've been doing all right without them as long as there's been any horses." His grandfather hadn't been one to mollycoddle livestock, or people either, for that matter. Charlie thought that might have been because he had never been mollycoddled himself, and probably didn't know how to go about it. The crunch of tires on gravel and clatter of a diesel engine coming up the lane meant Thomas Begay had arrived, and when he got out of his truck he was already smiling and pointing at the shed. Thomas never missed an opportunity to say, "I told you so," which was exactly what he did say as he settled himself alongside his friend. Leaning on the top rail, he surveyed the afflicted shelter with a critical eye. "I told you those corner posts should be stuck in the ground deeper, and as I said before, the roof poles should have been a little closer together, too." Charlie didn't bother to look at him. "I thought you were supposed to bring Harley with you." "Well," Thomas scuffed the dirt, "I've got some news about Harley." He looked down as he said this, and Charlie could tell by his voice it wasn't going to be happy news. Both men considered the shed for another full minute before Charlie sighed and asked what had happened with Harley Ponyboy. He already knew he wasn't going to like whatever it was. Thomas fiddled with a tiny splinter he'd picked up from the corral. "He's drinking again, for one thing." Then hastened to add, "But that's likely just 'cause Anita left him last week." Thomas wanted Charlie to know there was good reason for their friend to fall back into the same old trap. "Yep. Just up and pulled the rug out from under him. Didn't say a damn thing, neither. Took everything she could get in her truck and went to live with her mother over by Kirtland." Thomas shook his head. "She told her mother the only reason she didn't kick his ass out and take the place for herself was 'cause it wasn't worth taking. Said Harley had let it run down to the point it wasn't even fixable anymore." "What the—" "Yeah. I went by the co-op early this morning thinking he might be hanging around looking for a job like he does sometimes. He wasn't there, but his father-in-law was, loading feed. He told me all about it when he saw I hadn't already heard. He knows Harley, and me has always been tight." "Anita left him because he was drinking?" "No, I guess Harley didn't even start drinking until after she left. This was about something else, according to her father." "He didn't say what?" Thomas shook his head. "No, and I didn't ask him neither. I could see he was some put out about the whole thing. Or maybe just about Anita coming back home to live. One or the other, I guess. Anita was never an easy one to get along with, you know." Charlie realized he had been holding his breath and exhaled in a long, slow sigh. "I hate to see that, and I'm sure Professor Custer will be disappointed too. That is, assuming George hasn't started drinking again himself. Harley and the professor had gotten along quite well when drinking, as long as Harley could keep up. They made an odd pair. You wouldn't think two so different people would take such a liking to one another, but they did." Thomas agreed. Yes, they did. And Harley never really cared for no white people neither." "I suppose we ought to go find them before he gets himself in a jam." Charlie was watching two magpies in one of the young cottonwoods across the pasture. For a moment he thought they were considering building a nest, but that wouldn't make sense. The tree was too short and spring too far off. He was sure they both were this year's hatch. Perhaps the mild weather was giving them the urge to start something. Thomas again eyed the ailing shed. "Do you want me to hook onto that thing with my truck, pull it down before it falls down and maybe kills one of those horses?" He smiled. "Sue's not going to like it if her horse gets killed." He didn't look at Charlie when he continued in a whisper. "It's going to have to be totally rebuilt anyway." Charlie briefly considered this. "No, I guess not. Those horses already know better than go anywhere near it." He knew Thomas was itching to show what his truck could do. Charlie, for his part, still thought the shed might be saved, and hopefully without starting from scratch. His friend knew a lot about building, but he didn't know everything. Thomas nodded and studied the horses as they looked on, and at last decided they were already on their guard, and not likely to fall victim. He grinned at his friend. "All righty then. Let's go see if we can find Harley. Maybe he'll be sober enough to help us prop this thing up, if that's what you've got in mind. I personally don't recommend it." Charlie headed for the house to tell Sue what was happening, but he wouldn't mention the shed. Another perfectly good Sunday morning shot all to...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?